a farmer has come up against a hard year. There was a drought, or maybe this time it was a hurricane. They harvest all that they can, but this year there's not enough. Not enough crops to feed their family, not enough seed for next year's planting. The farmer needs a loan to buy some seed, to restart next season, to hopefully get back on their feet. And since there are very few options for survival, the farmer does what is required. They put up their land, their ancestral heritage, as collateral on a loan which, if they're lucky, has an interest rate of 60%. And if they can't find someone quite so generous, comes with a 200% interest rate. Maybe this farmer makes it, but maybe the one next door doesn't. They also had to put up the farm that has sustained their family for generations, but pests ran through their crops that second year. And at the one next door to that, the farmer grew seriously ill. At the one across town, a hailstorm has damaged their most precious crop. These families lose most or even all of their lands, becoming poor, subsistence-level peasants or day laborers. And the wealthy elite amassed more and more and more land. Theologian and social scientist William Hartzog, who studies ancient agrarian societies and aristocratic empires, argues that this was the cultural context into which Jesus told what we call the parable of the talents. A landowner, in his great wealth and privilege to do so, goes off on a journey for an indeterminate amount of time. Summoning those servants or retainers who do his bidding, the man hands over to the first an amount of money equaling more than 15 years' wages, and to the second, about 6 years' worth of wages for a day laborer. It's astounding that the master calls these sums a few things. Even to the third servant who only receives 1 talent, 3 years' worth of salary is entrusted to him. When the master returns, not only did the first 2 retainers double the master's money, but they would have made more besides to keep for themselves. That's how they got paid for doing the dirty work. Hartzog argues that Jesus' hearers would have understood how these 2 made such enormous gains. The only way to have made more than 100% profit was through exploitation and unjust means, astronomical interest rates, foreclosures on the ancient lands of people's livelihoods. Enter the third retainer, who says to the landowner's face, "Master, I know you're a harsh man. You reap where you did not sow and gather where you did not scatter seed." And the master doesn't actually refute this. We can imagine that maybe he's speaking sarcastically when he responds, "Oh, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter?" But his actions prove him to be a harsh man. He says further to the third servant, "I should have at least received interest on my money. And because you didn't produce for me, you shall be thrown out. You shall become one of the worthless, landless, with no prospects. You are worthless." Now, for those of us who have been taught that the rich, powerful, wealthy, landowning master always represents God in these parables, this presents something of a problem. To be clear, there are many ways into a parable. Part of their staying power is that they always have more to teach us. We understand them differently depending on our place in history, our position relevant to power structures, our personal histories, and much more. There are spiritualized readings of this parable that help us to see our responsibility in regards to what God has given us. But I want to suggest that we ought to take seriously the critique that presenting God as a slave-owning master who is willing to toss people into the outer darkness is highly problematic, to say the least, and is incredibly damaging. And further, that any time we are able to read one of Jesus' parables as propping up systems of oppression and advocating for unlimited expansion of wealth, we would do well to take another look. Liz Neely, scientist and executive director of the Story Collider, says that when we listen to stories, we participate in what she calls narrative transportation. Our whole brains get involved, the parts processing both emotion and intellect, the parts that understand information and the parts that try to make predictions. She says that this way of stories, it invites us to profound perspective taking, where identifying with a person or character leads us to come out of the story with a shift in attitude. We step back into the real world changed. If we let go of the idea that the master must represent God, where might we find ourselves reflected? Who do we identify with, really? If Herzog is right, Jesus is calling out the whole system and is asking us to look at the ways we participate in it. Maybe we're the ones who expect unlimited returns on our investments. Maybe we are one of those skimming profit off an unjust system. Maybe sometimes we're even the silent bystanders the master is apparently addressing, ready to help toss aside those deemed worthless. The rich getting richer, the poor going deeper in debt. We see that all around us. A system in which those who have are given more and have an abundance, and from those who have nothing, even what they have is taken away, is not hard to imagine. I don't believe Jesus is offering this as a model or a statement of what heaven is like. I think maybe the parable is meant to grab us here in our recognition that this is how the world works, and in our emotional reaction to hearing the harsh master's ruthless support of it. The master then exposes to us what that must mean, that those deemed worthless are cast aside with weeping and gnashing of teeth. We are right to be appalled. Once we recognize the harsh master we serve, we choose what happens next. The third slave offers us a way forward, even as he warns us of the cost. In refusing to collaborate with oppression, he is considered worthless by those with power. In identifying with those the world is ready to throw out, he finds himself tossed aside too. And yet, this is the way of the cross. Jesus is warning his disciples that at the end of the age, all manner of division, persecution, and disaster will be happening, including this kind of injustice. And he goes on immediately to say that when the Son of Man comes, people will be separated based on whether they gave food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, whether they welcomed the stranger, clothed the naked, or visited the imprisoned, not whether they yielded an increase on their investments or made more of whatever it was God gave them to start with. We can continue to reap the benefits of others' exploitation, or we can call out the system for what it is. We can toss others aside, or we can feed, clothe, welcome. Of course, our reality is far more complicated than this, with well-meaning choices that do, in fact, hurt others. There are areas of our lives where we benefit and areas where we serve. What ultimately matters, Jesus is saying, is that we relentlessly work towards that way of offering real and tangible care. This parable calls that question for us. Who are we in this parable? What shifts for us in recognizing ourselves there? Let's try setting aside the lessons we've always been told it teaches for a moment, so that we can let this complicated, ancient story grab hold of us again. Let this narrative work its way into our hearts. Together, we can step into these questions Jesus poses to see both what is in our world right now, and even more importantly, what could be. How might we come away from this story changed?